Okay, this is the teacher recording document for the Fountas and Pinnell word test for grades 3 through 5. We're going to be giving the word test, we're pretending to give the word test to a student named Becky who is a 4th grader. Because she's a 4th grader, we're going to use list 3 because you take the number of their grade level and you go back one. So I'm just going to mark through list 2 so I know that this would never apply to Becky because she's a 4th grader. As I have Becky read, and we'll show you what that looks like in another video, but as I have Becky read, I'm going to show you the way that the teacher will note the student's errors and the words that the student reads correctly. When a student reads a word correctly, you're going to just put a check mark next to that word. So if you were to imagine that a student read the words plate, year, and noise correctly, each of those words is going to get a check mark. When the students make an error, there are different ways that you can mark it, and there are different types of errors that you will mark. If a student refuses to read a word, that's an error, and you can just place a line next to the word to show that the student refused to read the word. If a student reads a word incompletely, for example, if a student were to read the word twist instead of twisted, we would just mark what they said, twist instead of twisted, and that would be an error. This applies to words that should be pluralized, or words that are not pluralized that the student reads correctly. So, for example, if they say knives instead of knives, or if they say cat instead of cat, that would be the same kind of error. So that's an error if they leave an ending off. If a student reads a word incorrectly, so for the word giant, if a student were to say giant instead of giant, you would actually need to write out phonetically what the student said. So I would write out giant as if the student had said giant instead of giant. If the student were to go back and self-correct and actually arrive at the word giant eventually, that would be correct. When a student self-corrects, then the word is ultimately correct and not marked as an error. After you have had the child read the entire list to you, you go down to the bottom portion and you total up the number of errors. If the student reads all of the words correctly or reads 19 of the words correctly, then you would move on and have the student read the next list and mark the words on the next list. If the student reads 18 words correctly or fewer than 18 words correctly, then you would use the chart, which I'll show you in another video, to determine what level of reader you would start assessing the child with. Now I'm going to show you what it would look like for a student when they're taking the word test. So again, we're imagining that we're working with a 4th grade student named Becky. So we're using word list 3 to start with because she's a 4th grader. You actually hand the list to the student, and just to make sure that they're reading just one line of words and not trying to go across, because that's not the way that it is on your recording sheet, we're just going to take a sticky note and actually cover up one side so that the student knows to focus on just this list. You also want to give the student an index card that they can move down the page as they read the words, but you want the student to be holding the page and you want the student to be the one actually moving the index card down as they read. When you hand these items to the student, you can explain what they do with the index card, but you want to use very specific language when you explain to them what their task is. You want to say, I want you to read some words. When you come to a hard word, try it. If you cannot read it, go on to the next word. I'll be making notes while you read, and then you instruct them to start here so they know where to start. That's the exact language. It's included in the assessment tool, so you'll know exactly what language to use. And as the student's moving the card down, you're recording the responses as we showed you in the other video. As they're doing this, you never want to prompt, coach, or ask the students to repeat a word unless you didn't understand what they said because they were too quiet or it was mumbled or something like that. You will never read the words for the student. Even if they ask you to read the words, there are no tells on the word list. So if they do ask you to read a word, just ask them to move on to the next word. So you'll just do this, have the student go all the way through this side of the words, and then you can go ahead and just move the sticky note over and have them read the other side and move the index card themselves. And again, if they get 19 of the words correct, if they get 20 of the words correct, then you're going to move on to another list. If they get 18 or fewer words correct, then you'll use the chart to determine what level of text they'll actually be reading. Okay, I just want to show you what you do when a student ultimately misses more than 1 on a word test. So in this instance, the student missed 3. They got 17 out of 20. When a student gets 17 out of 20 on list 3, which is the list that we use with this student, you would come down here, and according to this chart, the student would be reading a level L text. So you go into your Fountas and Pinnell assessment kit, and this year we're using nonfiction text only. So you find the level L nonfiction text, and that's the first text that you would read with the student. Again, if the student did not miss 3, if the student had just missed 1 or even 0, so if they got a score of 19 out of 20 or 20 out of 20, you would move on to the next list. And then depending on how many they missed there, you'd be looking at the list 4 column. And then if they moved on to list 5 because they read all or only had 1 error on list 4, then you'd be looking at list 5. So the chart moves across as the students progress through the levels of list. But a student can only progress if they get a score of 19 out of 20 or 20 out of 20 in grades 3 through 5.